Brad Pitt, a name that once evoked glamour, ambition, and the kind of mythical allure that only a few could ever hope to attain. For decades, he wasn't just a star, he was the star, the one who effortlessly stood at the apex of fame and beauty, capturing imaginations around the world. To millions, he was the very embodiment of Hollywood magic. Women adored him, men admired him, directors coveted his presence, and magazines couldn't publish fast enough to keep up with his image. Wherever he went, the world followed. From his sun-kissed hair to his chiseled features, Brad Pitt seemed almost too perfect to be real. His life appeared charmed, his success unstoppable, and his romances the stuff of cinematic legend. On the surface, he had it all: fame, fortune, and an endless parade of accomplishments. But behind the curtain, beneath that golden glow, lay a life far more fragile, more fractured, and infinitely more human than most ever knew. Brad's story doesn't begin on a red carpet or a movie set. It begins far away from all of that, in the quiet heart of Missouri. Raised in Springfield after being born in Shawnee, Oklahoma, Brad was the eldest child in a family that valued order, discipline, and religious tradition. His father, William, ran a trucking company, and his mother, Jane, was a school counselor, a woman full of warmth, yet also firmly devoted to the codes of their Baptist upbringing. From the outside, his childhood appeared serene, ordinary, even wholesome. But for Brad, it was a childhood lived behind a carefully constructed smile. By the age of 6, he had already learned to suppress his feelings, to read the emotional weather in a room before speaking, and to anticipate the expectations of others, without ever voicing his own needs. He was charming at school, athletic on the field, and seemingly happy to those who only saw him from a distance. Yet inside, he was quietly unraveling. He would later admit that he carried deep feelings of guilt and shame, though he couldn't quite explain why. There was no dramatic trauma, no overt cruelty. But perhaps that's what made it even more difficult, because the pain was invisible and thus never acknowledged. In a household where appearances mattered and emotions were often muted in the name of faith, Brad learned to hide. And he became good at it. In church, he would sit perfectly still, counting his breaths and trying not to fidget, terrified that curiosity might come off as doubt. At home, he kept his questions to himself. At school, he tried to outrun the silence by performing, by being the best, the most likable, the golden boy everyone wanted him to be. But when he was alone, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, he often felt unseen, unheard, and unanchored. By the time he was a teenager, Brad wasn't just hiding his pain, he was actively burying it. He became skilled at slipping into roles. Long before he ever stepped onto a movie set, the act of pretending became a survival strategy. In a home where emotional expression was limited, acting, ironically, offered him the only space where he could safely explore his truth. It was this silent yearning, this hunger for something beyond the confines of his small-town upbringing, that eventually led him west. In college, he studied journalism and advertising, but he could never shake the feeling that his life was happening somewhere else. With only 2 credits remaining before graduation, he made a decision that stunned those around him. He packed his car and left for Los Angeles. It wasn't just a physical departure, it was a spiritual jailbreak. Armed with $325, a battered car, and a handful of cassette tapes, he arrived in LA. With nothing but raw ambition and a dream too big for the Midwest. To survive, he took odd jobs, some so far removed from acting they seemed almost surreal. He chauffeured dancers to parties, delivered appliances, and even wore a giant chicken costume to advertise a restaurant. It was humiliating at times, degrading even. But to Brad, it was worth it, because each hour spent doing those jobs brought him one step closer to acting classes where, finally, he could shed the mask. It was in those small, sweaty studios, especially under the guidance of Coach Roy London, that he was told something transformative. His vulnerability was not weakness. It was power. For the first time, someone told him that the pain he had hidden for so long could actually be a source of strength. That trembling was not something to be ashamed of. It was something to explore. That realization marked the beginning of Brad Pitt not as an image, but as an artist. From 1987 to 1990, he scraped by on bit parts, blink and you miss it appearances on television shows like Dallas and Growing Pains. He was always the handsome stranger, the charming background character. Casting directors liked his face, but few gave him credit for having depth. And while the paychecks were small, they gave him just enough to keep going. Then came the moment that changed. Everything, and yet in a cruel twist, threatened to define him forever. In 1991, Brad appeared in Thelma and Louise for less than 15 minutes. Shirtless, cocky, and flirtatious, he captured the attention of a global audience almost overnight. Posters with his smirking face and sculpted torso flooded dorm rooms and magazine covers. Suddenly, Brad Pitt wasn't just a working actor. He was a sensation. But that role, while catapulting him to stardom, also trapped him inside a cage of perception. He became a symbol of physical perfection, and with that came an expectation that overshadowed his deeper ambitions. To the public, he was dazzling, but to himself, he was unfinished. The fame that followed felt hollow. He didn't want to be known for a six-pack or a flirtatious grin. He wanted to be known for what he could express, for the stories he could tell. It was the cruelest irony. The very role that made him famous also threatened to erase the soul he had spent so long trying to show. He had escaped Missouri to find his voice, only to be silenced again, this time by the roar of applause that didn't truly see him. Fame had finally opened its arms to Brad Pitt, but instead of feeling liberated, he felt more confined than ever. The pressure to maintain an image, to be the handsome heartthrob, the golden boy of the silver screen, left little room for the artist inside him to breathe. And yet, rather than surrender, Brad chose to push back, to fight for a career that meant more than surface beauty. He sought out roles that challenged him, that required more than just good looks. In A River Runs Through It, audiences glimpsed a layered, melancholic performance that hinted at the inner complexity he longed to share. And in Legends of the Fall, he became not just a symbol of physical allure, but of tragic masculinity, wild, haunted, and profoundly human. But it was Seven that signaled a turning point, with its grim tone and psychological weight. It allowed Brad to step deeper into the shadowy corridors of human emotion. He no longer had to be the golden boy. He could be flawed, broken, and tormented. Then came Fight Club, a film that redefined his career and made him an icon for an entirely new generation. Edgy, rebellious, and unpredictable, it cemented Brad's status not just as a movie star, but as a cultural phenomenon. By the early 2000s, Brad Pitt stood at the very summit of Hollywood's Olympus. He was commanding $20 to $30 million per film, with box office successes like Troy and Mr. and Mrs. Smith proving that he could draw audiences across genres. He wasn't just admired, he was worshipped, and yet, deep inside, something still gnawed at him. In interviews, he began to hint at his unease. "I was uncomfortable in my own skin," he admitted, revealing that behind the charisma and success was a man still hiding from his own truths. He turned to alcohol as a salve, numbing himself in quiet corners of hotel rooms and Hollywood mansions, sipping through nights that refused to be silenced by applause. Magazines continued to label him sexiest man alive, but in solitude, Brad fell hollow. At the peak of his fame, he was lonelier than ever. The same qualities that had made him desirable, his charm, his smile, his image, had become walls that separated him from real intimacy. He longed for something deeper, something real. That yearning eventually found its outlet in storytelling. In 2001, Brad co-founded Plan B Entertainment, a production company that would go on to back some of the most daring and critically acclaimed films of the next 2 decades. Through projects like 12 Years a Slave, Moonlight, and The Big Short, he showed the world that his talents extended far beyond what could be captured on camera. He had an eye for stories that mattered, and he became a voice for voices that Hollywood had often ignored. But even as his work behind the scenes earned accolades, his personal life remained a delicate, painful tightrope. Relationships that began with the warmth of promise often ended in silence. His early romances, brief, passionate, still finding her own voice, called off the engagement. Brad was shattered. He later described that time as one of the darkest in his life, where the silence in his heart echoed louder than any. Applause. Then came Jennifer Aniston. She was everything he seemed to need at that moment. Kind, grounded, and radiating warmth. When they married in 2000, it was as if the universe had finally aligned. Their wedding was the stuff of legend. An oceanfront ceremony in Malibu, complete with fireworks, a gospel choir, and 50,000 flowers. The media dubbed them Hollywood's golden couple. To the outside world, they were perfect. But inside their home, shadows grew. Jennifer longed for children, and Brad once dreamed aloud of having a large family, even joking about raising 7 kids. Yet the years passed, and the silence of empty rooms began to weigh heavily. Jennifer became the subject of relentless tabloid scrutiny, her body and choices dissected in cruel detail. Every rumor, every false headline, left her feeling more exposed and misunderstood. Brad, meanwhile, was slipping deeper into restlessness. Career demands pulled him in one direction, personal discontent in another. The light that had once danced between them began to dim. When asked in an interview if Brad was the love of her life, Jennifer's answer, "He's certainly a big love in my life," felt tender, but tinged with quiet heartbreak. And then, in 2005, it all came crashing down. Their separation wasn't just a breakup. It was an earthquake. Fans mourned the loss of their favorite love story as though it were their own. Jennifer became a symbol of betrayal, and Brad, fairly or not, was labeled the villain. The pain was real on both sides. Jennifer bore her sorrow with remarkable dignity, choosing silence over scandal. She spoke of her grief only in measured tones, never lashing out, even when the media demanded drama. Brad, too, was lost. He had not only lost a partner, he had lost the one person who seemed to steady his spirit when the world became too loud. It would take years for him to fully understand cost. And by the time the realization came, it was too late. In the aftermath of his divorce from Jennifer Aniston, Brad Pitt stood at a crossroads, professionally unstoppable, but personally adrift. It was during this fragile, vulnerable period that a new presence entered his life, a force of passion and unpredictability that would reshape his destiny. Angelina Jolie. They met on the set of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, a high-octane action film that would ignite one of the most talked-about romances in modern pop culture. What was scripted as a fictional marriage between two assassins turned into something far more real, far more dangerous. From the very beginning, their chemistry was undeniable, electric, and utterly impossible to ignore. For Brad, Angelina represented everything that Jennifer was not. Where Jennifer offered steadiness and tenderness, Angelina brought fire and freedom. She was bold, defiant, and unconcerned with how the world perceived her. And to a man who had spent his life trapped in the performance of perfection, that recklessness felt intoxicating. Brad would later admit that being with her was like waking up from a long sleep. Angelina, too, confessed she never expected a fall for someone already committed. But their connection, she said, became undeniable. The media, of course, exploded. What had once been Hollywood's favorite marriage transformed overnight into a scandal of epic proportions. Brad became the object of scrutiny. Angelina was labeled the seductress. And Jennifer, the woman left behind, was wrapped in the public's sympathy and sorrow. But while the world debated and judged, Brad and Angelina forged ahead, seemingly immune to the chaos they had created. What began as a controversial romance evolved into a global family. Brad embraced fatherhood in a way no one had expected. He adopted Angelina's children, Maddox and Zahara, before welcoming Pax, then their biological daughter Shiloh, and later, twins Knox and Vivian. Within a few years, the couple had 6 children, a sprawling, multicultural family that seemed to exist both in the glare of the paparazzi and in the distant corners of humanitarian missions. For a time, it appeared Brad had found his purpose, not in the limelight, but in the roles of father and partner. He spoke often about how fatherhood had changed him, grounded him, and given his life a new dimension of meaning. The family traveled the world, attending film premieres, visiting refugee camps, and building what looked from the outside like a utopian modern dynasty. They lived in mansions in Los Angeles, flew on private jets, and yet remained, in moments strangely normal, parents chasing after toddlers, sharing ice cream, holding hands. But beneath that portrait of unity, cracks had begun to form. Angelina poured herself into humanitarian work, disappearing into war zones and global crises. Brad, meanwhile, juggled the demands of a movie career with the quiet unraveling at home. He began drinking more, numbing himself once again, this time not from loneliness, but from the pressure of trying to hold it all together. "I was drinking too much," he would later admit. "I couldn't remember a day without it." Even when they married in 2014 at their estate in France, a wedding surrounded by their children, with Angelina's veil decorated with the kids' crayon drawings, the cracks were undeniable. They smiled for the cameras. They said the right words. But the strain had already taken root. Angelina's health battles added further complexity. After testing positive for the BRCA1 gene, she underwent major preventive surgeries, including a double mastectomy and the removal of her ovaries. Brad stood by her side through it all. But illness has a way of exposing the deepest fissures in a relationship. Angelina later said that while those experiences brought them closer for a time, they also highlighted differences in how they approached life and love. Then came the breaking point. In September 2016, on a private jet high above the clouds, something happened. An incident so charged that it altered the course of their family forever. The exact details remained sealed in legal documents, but what followed was swift and final. Angelina filed for divorce. She stated clearly that her decision was made for the safety and well-being of her family. The world was stunned, but those closest to the couple saw it as the inevitable end of something that had long been deteriorating. The separation wasn't just a personal blow. It triggered a bitter and drawn-out custody battle that would drag through headlines and courtrooms for years. Brad entered therapy. He got sober. He faced his demons. "I had to take ownership," he said with painful honesty. "I had to confront my failings." But the most profound loss wasn't the end of his marriage. It was the unraveling of his role as a father. Maddox, his eldest, distanced himself completely. Pax followed. Even Zahara and Shiloh, once the center of his world, grew quiet. The home that had once echoed with laughter now fell into silence. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Brad confessed, "I hit the lottery with my kids, and then I wasted it." Those words cut deeper than any tabloid headline. Because for Brad, fatherhood wasn't just an aspiration, it was redemption. And losing it felt like the collapse of everything he had tried to rebuild. And yet, the losses didn't stop there. Following his separation from Angelina Jolie, Brad Pitt found himself not just in a legal storm, but in a personal reckoning unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had once stood as the very definition of a man who had it all: fame, wealth, talent, a family. But now, the silence inside his homes was louder than any standing ovation he'd ever received. The custody battles stretched across months, then years, each new development echoing through the media. Headlines speculated, pundits theorized, but the real wounds were invisible, etched not on courtroom documents, but inside the hearts of the children caught in the middle. Maddox remained distant. Pax grew increasingly independent. Even Zahara and Shiloh, who had once looked at their father with adoration, slowly drifted into the periphery. And then came one of the most symbolic acts of all. On her 18th birthday, Shiloh filed legal documents to remove Pitt from her surname. For the world, it was a footnote in a celebrity news cycle. For Brad, it was devastating. It wasn't just the loss of a name. It was the erasure of connection, a quiet declaration that the bridge between them had collapsed. I hit the jackpot with my kids, and then I blew it. He whispered to a friend, his voice hollow. That sentence, raw and unguarded, captured the depth of a father's sorrow, one who had dreamed of bedtime stories and birthday cakes, of being a guiding light, only to become a memory his children were now choosing to distance themselves from. But life, unrelenting as it is, continued to test him. On August 5, 2025, Brad faced a loss that no award, no wealth, no romantic redemption could ever prepare him for. His mother, Jane Etta Pitt, passed away at the age of 84. For the world, it was simply a report of another Hollywood figure experiencing the passing of a parent. But for Brad, it was a heartbreak of unspeakable finality. Jane hadn't just been a mother. She was his first anchor, the gentle hand that had packed his suitcase when he left. Missouri, all those years ago, she had sent letters when he was broke, whispered comfort when he was heartbroken, and clapped the loudest during his most triumphant moments. At the 2019 Oscars, when Brad finally won his first Acting Academy Award, she had sat beside him, smiling quietly, squeezing his hand and saying with deep pride, "You did it, Bradley." That was the moment he had dreamed of since he was a boy. The validation not from the Academy, but from the one woman who had believed in him before the world did. Her passing didn't just take away a person. It took away the last steady, unshakable love in his life. In the weeks that followed her funeral, friends described Brad as aimless, consumed by a grief that couldn't be captured in words. He wandered his grand estate in Los Angeles, pausing at old photographs of Jane, sometimes dialing her number just to feel close to the void. She was the only one who never left me, he admitted. With Jane's death, something inside Brad seemed to collapse completely. His ex-wives had moved on. His children had grown distant. And now, the one voice that had always reminded him of his worth was gone. No headlines captured that depth. No camera flash could illuminate that darkness. But even as his inner world fell silent, the outer world kept spinning. Brad still attended premieres. He still worked. He still smiled for photographers. He still held the illusion. Behind the tuxedos and luxury homes, his Los Angeles mansion, the cliffside Carmel estate, the vineyard in France now entangled in lawsuits, he remained the golden boy in the eyes of many. But inside, the man was fading. The estate in Beverly Hills he had once shared with Jennifer Aniston had long since been sold. The home he had built with Angelina, filled with the laughter of 6 children, now belonged to strangers. And the vineyard where he had exchanged vows, the lush, sun-drenched fields of Chateau Miraval, had become a legal battlefield, poisoned by bitterness. He still had the symbols of wealth, the private jets, the luxury cars, the priceless watches. His fortune, estimated at over $400 million, was intact. But the riches that mattered most, the embrace of family, the pride of a mother, the innocent joy of fatherhood, had slowly slipped away. And through it all, Brad fought to stay standing. He leaned on therapy. He embraced sobriety. He committed to self-reflection. He turned inward, often choosing isolation over social scenes. The man once seen at every high-profile party now preferred yoga classes, Mediterranean meals, and quiet evenings away from the flashbulbs. He spoke openly about his face blindness, a condition that prevents him from recognizing even familiar faces. "People think I'm cold," he said, "but I just can't remember faces." It's deeply frustrating. In a career where memory and charisma had always been his weapons, this invisible condition became a quiet curse. Yet another wall, separating him from true connection. Still, Brad returned to what he knew best: storytelling, acting, producing. In 2024, he starred alongside George Clooney in Wolves, a reunion that reignited the kind of chemistry Hollywood rarely sees anymore. In 2025, he headlined F1, a high-octane blockbuster that roared to over $600 million worldwide. Audiences still showed up. He still had the magic. And yet, when the cameras shut down, when the crowds dispersed, when the accolades were shelved, he returned to silence. In the stillness of his Los Angeles home, surrounded by art, wealth, and memories frozen in time, Brad Pitt lives not in the shadow of his fame, but in the aftermath of everything it could not save. The walls of his mansion overlooked the same Hollywood hills that once symbolized his ascent. They were the backdrop to a life defined by red carpets and cover stories. But now, they watch over a man who no longer chases applause. The crown once worn so effortlessly feels heavier than ever. He still walks with grace, still captivates when he speaks, but there is a quiet weight in his gaze, a burden that comes not from failure, but from the unbearable price of success. He lives with Enz Ramon, a jewelry designer nearly 30 years his junior, someone who, by all accounts, offers him the companionship he never quite found in the public fairy tales of his past. Their life together is simple, private, and away from spectacle. No paparazzi pedals, no red carpet declarations, just quiet concerts, shared dinners, and attempts at something resembling peace. But peace is elusive, not because Brad hasn't tried to earn it, but because some wounds, no matter how deeply buried, leave echoes. In every quiet moment, the laughter of his children, once so vibrant, feels impossibly far away. The halls that used to ring with tiny footsteps are now filled with stillness. The stories once told at bedtime have no audience. The home he once built for love now shelters the memory of everything love took from him. Brad's health is stable, but sobriety, though a hard one, remains a daily choice, a commitment that speaks to the strength he seldom advertises. He has traded late nights and cocktails for discipline, balance, and mindfulness. He meditates, he exercises, he eats clean, and yet there is no escaping the truth. He is a man who has known more, lost than most would ever imagine, because beneath the Oscars and magazine spreads, beneath the legacy of Fight Club, 7, and 12 Years a Slave, lies a story that fame could never rewrite. A story of a boy from Missouri who became a man adored by millions, only to be undone by the very thing he chased. His mother, Jane, the only person who loved him without condition, is gone. His marriages, once the center of tabloid adoration, have ended in silence. His children, once his greatest dream, have drifted from his arms. And yet, he wakes up each day. He still goes to set. He still tells stories. He still believes that redemption is possible, even if it comes quietly, far from the spotlight. Brad Pitt once said, "Fame is not freedom." It was a cage, a beautifully decorated one, but a cage nonetheless. Today, at 61, that cage is no longer made of flashbulbs and expectations. It is memory itself. Memory of love lost, of children's voices fading, of a mother's hand that will never squeezes again. And yet, in that heartbreak, something extraordinary has taken root. A resilience not built on perfection, but on survival. Brad Pitt is not the man the world thought he was. He is not the eternal heartthrob or the flawless hero. He is not the myth. He is the man who has fallen and stood again, who has loved and lost, who has tried and failed and still tries again. His legacy may one day be etched in gold statues and Hollywood history books, but his true story, the one that matters most, is this: he is still standing. And maybe that is enough, because in the end, it is not the applause that defines a life. It is what remains when the applause fades. Brad Pitt's tragedy is not that he faltered. It is that he succeeded in ways no one could imagine, and still lost what mattered most. But his courage, quiet, unglamorous, and constant, may be his greatest performance of all. So the question remains, unanswered and echoing in the silence he now lives. Will Brad Pitt ever find the peace he has searched for his entire life? Only time will tell.